Hello, and welcome to another edition of Focus One. Today we're going to be talking about climate change, sea level rise, and coastal vulnerability with an emphasis on Florida. We are very fortunate to have with us two special guests, Drs. Pierre Vellinga and Henry Pollack, both prominent scientists and members of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. As a collective body, the IPCC was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. Drs. Vellinga and Pollack have been making the rounds in Sarasota this week with radio and TV appearances, a Tiger Bay panel, and a public lectures at New College of Florida and Eckerd College. I'm pleased to be able to bring them on our show. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, lest I mess up the titles and credentials, maybe you can just tell us a little bit about your body of work, and then we'll go from there. Dr. Pollack, why don't you go first?
I'm a professor of geophysics at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And in recent years, my research has been focused on reconstructing past climates. I am a geologist and so have a backward-looking perspective in that regard. We've been able to study the climates of the last 1,000 to 2,000 years, and we try and use that time interval to give us a pre-industrial perspective to understand the climate change that's taking place today in the industrial era.
And in addition to, again, a very long and illustrious career as a geophysicist, you have written a couple of books for popular consumption, right?
I have. The most recent, focusing on climate change, is called A World Without Ice. And it takes a look at the role that ice plays in the global climate system and how changing proportions of ice and water on Earth lead to important changes in things that affect the humans that are here. An earlier book was called Uncertain Science, Uncertain World, and it looks at the way in which we use uncertainty and factor in uncertainty into public policy decisions, business decisions, and the like.
I haven't read that one yet, but I think I'm going to. Dr. Vellinga, tell us about yourself.
Yes, well, I'm a professor in climate change and flood risk at the Wageningen University, and also have a chair at the Free University of Amsterdam. My personal specialty is coastal zone management, and in particular coastal protection with soft solutions like dunes and marshes and what have you. Presently, I'm heading the National Research Program on adaptation to climate change in the Netherlands. How can we survive a few meters below sea level with rising seas and maybe changing storm conditions? And simultaneously, I'm advising Venice, Italy, on how to protect this historic city. And every now and then I go to Ho Chi Minh City because, well, this city is flooded almost 3-4 times a winter in major parts of the city.
You get around, certainly.
That brings this job, you know, if you study coastal stuff, you can travel.
And I did my dissertation work on fisheries, in part because there are some great venues for conferences. You also have a role with an organization called the Belmont Group. Maybe you just tell us a tiny bit about that.
That's right. Well, presently, you know, most nations organize the research nationally. They have a National Science Foundation, NSF. Similarly, we have a similar NSF. France does, Russia does. And this Belmont Forum is a grouping of G8, the most biggest economies of the world, like Brazil, China, US, France, and they joined hands to jointly formulate research questions, where then everyone, including, University of Southern Florida and others, Gainesville, they can write in the proposals. And last week I was in Washington, where we decided on out of 100, the 10 best proposals of the world, and they were now funded by this G8.
A very influential group with respect to making decisions about where research investments are made on climate.
That's right,
okay.
yeah.
We're going to be talking a little bit about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, and both of you participate on that. So let me start with you, Dr. Vellinga. It's, again, a very large, sweeping effort looking at a very broad range of science that affects or is related to the issue of climate change. Lots of scientists are working in different groups. Maybe just tell us a little bit about where you fit into that body.
Well, it started off much more modestly It was in 87 that a group of 20 scientists got together, including the later chair, Professor Bolin from Sweden, and they discussed how to deal with this issue. And then climate change was considered as an issue that would be winners and losers. Russia and Canada, for example, would be winners because they would have much longer growing seasons and less ice. And Mediterranean countries, for example, would be losers because of loss of rainfall. And we thought, but that's not really true, because in the end, even the Russians would lose because of permafrost melt, like the Canadians. They couldn't travel as easy on land anymore. And we said, well, maybe we scientists have to work together to not make this an issue that will divide countries, but will bring countries together on an equal science basis. Well, and what is an equal science basis? You know, most scientists like to disagree with their colleagues and to find something else. Right. So this was quite an endeavor to bring these scientists together, and they found a number of things, like CO2 is warming the earth, and CO2 mainly comes from fossil fuels, where they had full consensus. Some other issues didn't fully agree upon. There was disconsensus, and some things were pure speculation. And it was then agreed to set up this panel with the World Meteorological Organization and UNEP, United Nations Environment Program, to have it open to all scientists of the world to assess what is known, what is maybe true, and what is speculation, and setting this up in a very systematic way. And since then it has grown and grown, and it became so powerful in 2007, and with such far-reaching statements that it really shocked the world. And they were then also criticized because there were still a few errors, mistakes somewhere in a 3,000-page book. But of course, if it's politically and economically such an important issue that they continue to work on it, and the next report will be forthcoming this year. And it will contain even more evidence that climate is changing. We can measure it now, the sea level is accelerating, etc.
And you're one of the, in the last report, were one of the lead authors for the chapter on coastal vulnerability.
Well, I've contributed to the first 3 reports quite extensively, and now I'm mainly a reviewer, and there is a younger generation putting all its new scientific stuff in there.
Dr. Pollack, tell us a little bit about, again, your role in the IPCC.
My role was in contributing to some of the chapters in the 3rd and 4th report. And I, like Peter, are now principally a reviewer of the next upcoming report. And a point to make about the assembly of this report is that the IPCC does not do research. It collects research that has been published in the peer-reviewed journals of the scientific world.
Peer review of the peer review, if you will. Yes.
Well, that's right. We discuss the various positions that have been published. We try and find the commonalities. We try and find the divergences and understand why there's a divergence of opinion, and make assessments of various pathways that we might approach the future. But we don't say what to do. What the IPCC does, it gives a series of pathways that says, if this is the path you follow, this is what you might expect to happen.
Right.
If you follow a different path, you can expect a different set of circumstances.
Scenario analysis.
It's scenario analysis, that's right. And the range of the scenarios, in particular about the rate of warming and the rate of sea level rise, depend very much on how the population plans for its future. If it plans to make a rapid transition to non-carbon-based fuels, one can expect a lesser rise of temperature, a lesser rise of sea level. If, on the other hand, the global economies continue to use fossil fuels in ever-increasing amounts, you get a much higher rate of, a much higher temperature at the end of the century and a much greater rise in sea level. So we present alternative pathways to the future and project their consequences but we are not a policy making.
That's right. Very good. Very important point to make. There have been 4 assessment reports that have been put out by the IPCC, and in some respects, we had mentioned, or I used the term in the Tiger Bay forum, best of times, worst of times, since the last report was put out. Again, the receipt of the Nobel Peace Prize, and I think a lot of, or there were high expectations that the world and some of the major players would come together at Copenhagen and there would be a consensus in terms of a more aggressive or bold path of action. And that didn't come to fruition, and as you had noted, there were issues with email hacking and ClimateGate and a little bit of scrutiny, some of it manufactured or unjustified. But nevertheless, there was sort of a peak of scrutiny. Things have sort of, I think, eased a little bit, and now assessment report number 5 is coming out. It's been almost 6 years since the last one came out, and so what's new? What I don't know if you've seen that or if you've done some of, again, the review already. What should we be looking for that's in this report that we didn't really know in terms of the last report?
Well, one of the things that the next report will speak about in terms of sea level rise, and I helped as a reviewer of that chapter as well, is that the assessments of sea level rise are greater than they were in the 4th assessment report. The 4th assessment report did a very good job of analyzing the warming of the sea and the melting of mountain glaciers, like in Glacier National Park and such. It totally sidestepped the issue of whether big ice was being lost from Greenland and Antarctica and deposited into the sea and raising sea level. It simply said we don't know enough about that. The 5th report coming out takes a little bit, still a timid step in that direction, but they are giving estimates of ice loss, and the ice loss is not trivial. And so the estimates of sea level rise following the various scenarios are greater than in the last report. I would say that the consensus of expected sea level rise is probably close to 1 meter, say 3 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. It's at the top end of the IPCC range, but there are other estimates that go a little beyond IPCC as well. IPCC is a very conservative estimate because it is a consensus builder.
And so in terms of what's new, probably that area of sea level rise is probably what I think a lot of folks are going to focus on and what will probably get the media attention. And if I understand correctly, 3 sources of sea level rise: the thermal expansion, because warmer water just occupies more space; the glacial melt again, and these are things that I think that the scientific community has a fairly good handle on. But as you pointed out, sort of direct depositing sort of major portions of glaciers breaking off and going directly into the oceans was something that was not really factored into the equations in past reports, and you're starting to look at that now.
That's correct.
And they do bump up the projections
that's
in terms
correct.
of the probability. Dr. Vellinga, we have something in common, the Netherlands and
Florida, definitely.
If sea levels rise a meter over the next century or by the end of this one, if not more, but a meter, that's going to be fairly significant in terms of risk and vulnerability, correct?
Well, then you would be in a situation that we've been in for the last few hundred years. We have several cities that are 3-4 meters below sea level, including our main Schiphol airport. It's 4 meters below sea level. And we manage. So there is some hope for Florida, even if there are rising sea levels. But indeed, this new IPCC report, it has rechecked all the data and all competing theories again on solar variability and what have you. And it will come out, quite strong on that indeed global warming is now accelerating sea level rise. And we will have to make ourselves ready for that, because the expectations are indeed it would rise maybe this century 3 feet, but the next century another 6 feet, because it's unless we would be successful in reducing fossil fuel use and other greenhouse gas emissions.
Let's talk a little bit more about some of the specific things that are happening in your country with respect to fortifying and or increasing the protections of coastal zones. I think you made a very good point. You made it both at Tiger Bay as well as New College. One of the options with respect to sea level rise is simply retreat, move everything back, but that's a very costly and unlikely option. Much of economic output is connected into the coastlines in Netherlands, same here in Florida. Most of your coastal counties and your coastlines are responsible for a good portion of the economic activity. So it's unlikely we're going to abandon the coastlines. What are some of the things that you've done to, again, strengthen or defend them? What are some of the options that we might want to consider here in Florida?
Well, that's right. You know, our first response in the Netherlands was as well, maybe we have to retreat. So every new investment would be placed, say, 100 kilometers land inward. But when we discussed this and made the economics, it's just not viable. There is so much invested in the deep areas near the sea that abandoning this or even replacing it would be an economic loss. Most of our GDP, our money, is generated in the low-lying area, and we figured out how much it would cost to protect ourselves for an additional 3 feet of sea level rise, and it's less than 1% of GDP. So even if it would be wise to retreat, running less risk, still the economics tell you you better stay there and just protect yourself. And this is what's happening, but we are really going through a transition on protecting ourselves. Of course, like you and many other countries, we used to think in terms of concrete and sea walls, and we're increasingly now building with nature. So recreating marshlands, recreating barrier islands even to protect the existing coast, and heightening the boulevard like 10 feet, but using much sediment. We are applying mega nourishment schemes of 200 cubic meters in 1 year.
That's a huge amount
and
of
this
sand.
is 200 million cubic meters in 1 year. So that's very big. And we are fortunate because we have our North Sea, where there are trillions of cubic meters of sand. And in Florida, you're not as rich in terms of sand. So it will be a challenge to use the same techniques. But I would advise also here to start planning and look at these more softer solutions.
I want to come back in a little while and ask you how you paid for all of that. But before I do, I want to turn back to Dr. Pollack. There were a couple of areas of questioning that I think there's some important points that we might want to revisit and try to communicate some of the science to the general public. One, well, the first one might be a bit more simple. It has to do with sort of regional variation. So if there's a certain global average or a projection for sea level rise worldwide, is that going to be consistently dispersed around the planet, or might the Gulf of Mexico vary somewhat?
That's a really good point. It's easy enough to project what the global average will be. But for planning purposes, you want to know what's going to happen right where you're planning. And there are regional variations that are associated both with the rise in sea level due to causes within the sea itself, such as thermal expansion and new water and the like. But there's also superimposed on that the fact that locally the ground may be going down, subsiding, while the water is going up, and that leads to an apparent rise of sea level much bigger than the global average. There are places in the world where the ground is coming up faster than the water is.
Such as?
Well, Hudson Bay in Canada, places that were depressed below sea level by the weight of the ice of the last ice age. That ice is now gone, and those areas are coming up. And they're coming up faster than
the sea is coming
up, and so it looks like the sea is retreating. So one needs to look carefully at the local variation. Along the eastern seaboard of the USA and in the Gulf, Florida is not much different than the global average, but around Norfolk, Virginia, there is subsidence taking place that is leading to already at high tide, there's flooding of coastal neighborhoods, and people have to leave their cars a few blocks away and wade into their homes.
Not good.
And in New Orleans, of course, we know the perils there. They're already building below sea level,
Right.
but it's a place also where the ground is subsiding as the sea is rising. And so it makes New Orleans particularly vulnerable. One point I'd like to make about vulnerability, you don't have to wait until the sea rises 3 feet as the next stage of consideration. Even in the process of raising the sea 1 foot in elevation, it simply makes the storm surges of lesser storms equal to a much bigger surge in the absence of any sea level rise.
I think and that's a very important point, but it's one point that I think hits home here, is certainly in this community, storm surges especially associated with hurricanes. So is it fair to say that it's not too far in the future that the storm surges that are associated with Category 1 and 2 hurricanes are going to look like right now what we would experience with a 3 or 4?
That's exactly the situation. I pointed out in some of the discussions we had earlier this week that Hurricane Gustav, which came in 2008, the storm surge of Gustav came right to the lip of the seawalls in New Orleans again. Had we had another foot of sea level rise on top of that, it would have been Katrina
all over again.
again.
That was a very compelling picture that you had there. Another point that I want to underscore is extrapolating from the past and projecting into the future. And so some of the discussion on sea level rise, we get a lot of questions from the audience that looks at the past century and says, well, we've had, 8 inches of sea level rise over the last 100 years. Well, that's not a big deal. We've adjusted to that, and I think the North Carolina legislature actually mandated that the planning community cannot consider anything more than what the extrapolation was over the last 100 years.
Have you adjusted to that? Even these 8 inches, they make a landfall of a hurricane even create much more damage. If you look at the insurance, the flood insurance premium you're paying now, that's a lot of money.
Right.
And it's more than 50 years ago when it was 8 inches lower, or 100 years ago. And probably it's going to double or triple over the next few decades as there will be disasters elsewhere. And I would say that this area, Tampa Bay area, Sarasota area, it's quite vulnerable. And you can read it from the insurance premiums. So, all experts in the world, that's why I'm happy to be here. Well, it's still all right. But, sooner or later, some hurricane will have a landfall here and things will look completely different. And it will be really a question, will investors rebuild in an area that's so prone to hurricanes? So I've really urged in my speeches, you start planning now. Because really defending the coast is not just a matter of money. And I spoke to a mayor, I believe it was Longboat Key, who said, it's so difficult because we have the city council, we have the county, we have the state, we have Washington, the Corps of Engineers. Going through all that red tape takes me 10, 20 years. I said, that's true. So you have to start today if you want to be ready in 20 years from now. So governance is a big issue. Money is there because you're paying already so much insurance premium, and you could really get a deductible if you make your house waterproof or if you raise your boulevard a bit. So there are incentive schemes can easily be developed for waterproofing, floodproofing the area.
And that was, I think, one of the take-home points in the presentations that I attended for you, and just maybe we can underscore that. The Netherlands is making some rather substantial investments in terms of fortifying its coast, protecting its coast, trying to reduce the vulnerability. The price tag seems quite large, but when you break that down in terms of per capita investments, it doesn't seem so scary. And I think one of the points that you made was that when you look at the money that individual households are putting into insurance premiums, it's kind of on par. And so in a way, it's perhaps redirecting that investment to sort of reducing the risk rather than insuring against it. Is that a fair characterization?
That's really a fair characterization. Say, for example, in the Florida area, 10 million people would live in a vulnerable area, and they each pay $100 per capita. Well, that would bring you already to $1 billion a year. What can you do with $1 billion a year, you know? If you invest for 100 years and you make some coastal protection that would last 50 years, well, then you could easily invest $10 to $100 billion to make the area more compatible or more protective. So in our country, we pay indeed about 200 to 500 euro, depends a little bit, so $200 to $500 per capita to survive even now and for another meter of sea level rise per capita per year. So,
and that's, again, that's comparatively not as shocking as it might sound.
Planning, organizing it, getting your act together, taking collective action, you know.
Right.
In your country, which I very much respect so much, entrepreneurship, and you do it for yourself, and you own your own land, is a good thing. But for coastal protection, you have to work together.
Right.
And that's a little more complex.
So again, another way just to recharacterize it, the risks are real, and as they manifest, we in the most vulnerable communities are going to pay for it one way or the other. We might invest a little bit early to reduce the risk. If not, then we're going to have to pay higher insurance premiums to insure against what will increasingly become more likely. On that more likely point, I do want to hit, you had a great phrase, I've heard it before, but again, underscoring that sort of that temporal variability, and it had to do with the 100-year storms, which apparently we saw one up, up
Yes.
in the Northeast.
Yes. The concept of a 100-year flood is based on historical statistics that say that there's, in a given year, one chance in 100 that we're going to see a flood of this magnitude. But as many people know, we seem to be seeing many more 100-year floods in various places than the historical record would suggest is probable. And what that is really telling us is that the basis on which we're making our predictions has a changing historical base, that we're now seeing processes put in action, in natural processes that were not active in the same way in the century of accumulation of data of earlier times. And so the insurance companies are very aware of this, that they're not dealing with a stationary system. It's a system in flux, a system in change. And the earlier we recognize the changes that are taking place, the better we plan for them.
Doctors Valinga and Pollack, we've really enjoyed having you in the community, and certainly we're utilizing you pretty aggressively in terms of getting out and communicating with a variety of different audiences. Just some impressions of your few days here thus far, and if there was, again, a take-home message that you wanted to leave with this community in terms of, again, getting ready for the new assessment that's coming out, what would be the most important point or two?
Well, my point would follow on to some of the points of the discussion we had today. Democracy is not a tidy process, and to work with all the various stages of government, local, state, national, takes time and effort and a few steps forward, a few steps back. It takes decades in some ways to create a policy framework that addresses the big changes that are coming. So my take-home message is it's time to get started. It's not time to be waffling on the issue any longer. If we expect protections to be in place in 30, 40, 50 years, we have to start planning them now and reaching accommodation in our governmental framework.
Well, I would like to frame climate change and sea level rise not really as a threat, but as an opportunity. And I want to give the story of the Port of Rotterdam. 4 years ago, it looked a bit sideways when we experts talked about climate change and sea level rise. Because, oh no, but then we would be vulnerable with all the industry there. But now they have made it their top priority. They have raised the port 5 meters, so 15 feet above sea level. And they're selling Rotterdam as the most climate and flood-proof area of the world. And investment is coming in. And this I would like to set as an example for this area. You know, if you can advertise yourself in 10 years' time as the safest place on earth for floods, you would have ongoing investments and recreation.
Dr. Vellinge, Dr. Pollock, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and insight, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your time here in Sarasota.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank you for joining us on this edition of Focus One. We'll see you again next week.